do this. I suppose the background for those in the call and for Andrew too is that some of us are doing reviews of different types of evidence within these work packages as part of the Spectrum project, and we've had a couple of discussions wrestling with what sort of methods we should use and how far we should diverge from sort of standard systematic review practice. And wouldn't it be nice if an expert could come and talk to us about some of these naughty reviews and different types of reviews and variant reviews and mutant reviews? And I thought Andrew's just the person to do this. So I'm sorry, it was me got you into this, Andrew. But anyway, thank you. So Andrew, I'm sure you'll have seen his work as a systematic review methodologist, and he's known for doing sort of complex reviews, mixed methods type reviews, reviews of qualitative evidence, non-mixed methods reviews as well, the sort of single malt type reviews, as well as the more complex blended versions. He's done reviews and evidence synthesis across a huge range of different topics, clinical topics and public health topics, realist reviews, meta-ethnography and so on, as well as producing reporting and methodological guidance relating to evaluation and to evidence syntheses. So I think he's the ideal person to shed light on some of these choices which one has to make when one's doing reviews of different sorts of evidence. So I'll leave it to Andrew then, and I'll be back at the end to organise the questions. Thanks very much, Andrew.
Lovely, thank you, Mark. And I'm certainly going to borrow that idea of single malt and blended reviews in the future. But for the moment, my working title is Same Species or Different Animal. I'm a co-convener of the Cochrane Qualitative and Implementation Methods Group, but these are my personal views, but I'd like to just credit my fellow co-conveners who've done much of the methodological work that I've been privileged to be alongside. So one of the issues that is frequently raised is whether these qualitative systematic reviews or qualitative evidence syntheses, as we prefer to call them within Cochrane, are meant to resemble quantitative systematic reviews, or whether they are in fact a different sort of animal with peculiar and individual characteristics. And that's been something that I've been particularly interested in. If there is such a thing as a reviewologist, then I would claim to be one, alongside international colleagues like Andrea Trico over in Canada, where we get hung up, perhaps some would say inordinately so, about the design of reviews and their purposes, and I'm going to share some of that with you today. So what I'd like to make a case for is that qualitative evidence synthesis is one of the most exciting and growing fields of systematic review, that it inhabits an uncertain meeting point because it derives its methods partially from systematic review methods, so imitating quantitative reviews, but partly gets inspired from primary qualitative research. And so I'm going to be trying to see the various heritages or legacies that we gain from those two strands, if you like. I'm going to talk about the criticism that if qualitative evidence synthesis mimics the quantitative systematic review too much, then it becomes something of a Frankenstein's monster. But the corollary to that is that if it's performed appropriately and in a way that is sensitive to the tradition and the methods and protections of qualitative research, that it can make a valuable contribution to knowledge. And that a judicious use of the methods can help us to expand what myself and colleagues here at SHA call the systematic review toolbox. And it's been estimated, I've got a spreadsheet somewhere, I think that there are over 100 different methods of reviews with their own labels. I'm going to focus mainly on the qualitative based and mixed methods ones today, but please do feel free to ask me questions about other review types at the end of the session if you're particularly interested. So qualitative evidence synthesis, I think it's almost compulsory to show this sort of graph generated fairly easily of a database like Medline or Scopus, but you can see a growing trend there from the mid-1980s, which is where systematic reviews started gaining traction, where certainly the numbers were in single figures for about the first 6 or 7 years. Now we're dealing with hundreds of reviews every year. I, on behalf of the Cochrane group, monitor a new qualitative syntheses. I've got quite a comprehensive search strategy, and so that typically involves me looking through about 100 Medline references a week. Not all of those are genuine qualitative evidence syntheses, but between 30 and 50 of those will be qualitative syntheses, and in addition there'll be other methods that use qualitative, like realist synthesis. And this has been quantified in this lovely and provocative article that we'll come back to later, just charting this this growth, not quite exactly the same figures, but the same curve that we've just said there. This is the work by Thorne, who accused the field of creating a Frankenstein's monster. And just if you'll just entertain a brief reflection here, my first involvement in qualitative systematic reviews came too many years longer ago than I'd care to remember. 20 years here, presented at a qualitative conference. I produced a paper that provocatively was called Cochrane or Cockeyed, saying, should we judge systematic reviews of qualitative research by the same standards as Cochrane had espoused for quantitative reviews? And as part of the publicity for that, I think the Cochrane Centre, UK Cochrane Centre, received our library newsletter. I received an email from Ian Chalmers, who many of you will know by reputation as one of the founding fathers of evidence-based practice, and particularly systematic reviews. And he asked for a copy of this conference paper, and reluctantly I exposed myself and my manuscript to him, and he very kindly took the time to annotate it, and one of the prevailing things that was over the manuscript was the word bias, and really emphasizing that the standards of quantitative research were being applied by him to the methodology that I was documenting there. I have to say that subsequently he was a very enthusiastic commentator on qualitative systematic reviews, particularly when we had our first exposure at a Cochrane colloquium, I think in Dublin, perhaps 6 or 7 years later. And now, of course, qualitative reviews are very much within the fold. That's the first review of qualitative evidence within Cochrane was published in the Cochrane Library in 2013. It was very much designed as a complementary accompaniment to a quantitative review. I can see I've actually made a mistake here in screenshotting the qualitative twice. So good that we named it twice, but they should actually show an effectiveness review and a corresponding qualitative review. But this was very much the view that these were things that were done very much alongside each other, and particularly it was an enhancement model, so the qualitative was only done to bring out the best of the quantitative review, the effectiveness review. Since then, there's been a plethora of methods, each with their different labels. And here again, I'll just briefly mention an anecdote that I was working with Mary Dixon Woods, where on a lunch break on a project, she told me that for another project she'd been working on, she'd developed this method, critical interpretive synthesis. And I was very critical, saying we don't need another method of qualitative synthesis. What are you doing inventing a new method? And I remember going on about how researchers reinvent very similar methods just to so they've got something to be cited for. And then it wasn't too long ago after that that myself and a colleague invented best fit framework synthesis, which fell into exactly the same trap that I'd accused Mary of falling into. So it's a case of don't do as I do. So it is potentially confusing for all of us, the terminology that surrounds qualitative synthesis. I'm not going to go through all of these terms. You will probably have encountered many of these yourself, but just to flag up a few highlights. So in the left-hand column, we have these umbrella terms that started very much as qualitative metasynthesis within nursing. As I've mentioned, within Cochrane, we've given the label qualitative evidence synthesis, a recognition that perhaps these methods can go beyond what is classically known as research and gone to include evidence more broadly. Within education, they prefer qualitative research synthesis. Social work has had to have its own version, which is qualitative interpretive metasynthesis. And then on the right-hand side, you have some of the individual methods. Some of these are more prominently known than others: framework synthesis, meta-ethnography, and thematic synthesis. And I placed realist synthesis there. Realist synthesis is really a mixed method, although it does tend to do a lot of its theorizing from qualitative research. And then in the middle, we have the new kids on the block, as it were. These are umbrella reviews. There are now so many qualitative syntheses around that it's not uncommon to find multiple ones on a particular topic. And so a few years ago, I think about 3 years ago, the term mega-ethnography was invented by Francis Toy and colleagues to refer to an umbrella review of multiple reviews that use meta-ethnography principles. And in my detective work on the internet, I've discovered an equivalent mega-aggregation, which is the equivalent of using a meta-aggregation in an overview of reviews. And notwithstanding my concern about labels, I have to say that at the moment for the World Health Organization, we're doing a two-part review to support guidelines on obesity in children and adolescents. And the first stage of that is a mega aggregation, looking at the phenomenon of obesity more generally. As you can imagine, lots of qualitative reviews already about that. And then we're taking a subset of those, which we're going to look in more detail, to look at people's reasons for initiating or continuing obesity management programs. And that's going to be the mega ethnography. So those are two that I haven't done before, but in about 3 months' time, I'll be able to add those to my methodological bedpost, as it were. And as mentioned, I've been trying to help people navigate their way around these different methods. This was part of an HTA project funded by the European Union, where as one of a number of items of guidance on reviewing complex interventions, I produced a guide to how to choose an appropriate method of qualitative evidence synthesis. And it's got lots of tables and graphs looking at different aspects that you might want from a qualitative synthesis, and helping you a sort of almost a which consumer's guide, or whatever, an Expedia, I suppose, of how to choose which method under which circumstance. Fundamental to this is a structure that I developed that also applies when you're looking at non-qualitative reviews, which is that there are 7 driving characteristics that determine what review type you choose. So this could equally go into the realms of scoping reviews or mapping reviews or something a bit more quantitative. But it was developed within qualitative synthesis. So the 7 ingredients that determine which review type you use are the research question, your assumptions about knowledge embodied in epistemology, 3 practical dimensions of the amount of time you have, the amount of resources you have, and the available expertise you have within your team, the audience and purpose, and the type of data. And although all of these are important, some for practical reasons and others for a range of other reasons, it's perhaps fair to say that the research question, the audience and purpose, and the type of data are probably the most important driving factors in your choice. Interesting just to see last week someone actually justified their choice of qualitative evidence synthesis in their article by actually reproducing a box that tried to articulate the decision that they'd actually made. So this obviously is gaining a bit of traction as a way of producing a justification for choice of method. But the good news, because we've opened up Pandora's box, the good news is that in very simplistic terms, the 3 primary choices that you would have in doing a qualitative synthesis are consistent and straightforward. They are thematic synthesis, framework synthesis, and meta-ethnography. And I'm going to briefly discuss some of the characteristics of each of those, but I would refer you to the guidance led by Jane Noyes, our lead convener within the Cochrane Qualitative Group, where this particular table has, for example, pros and cons and references. The thing I'll just flag up before I go into a little bit more detail on each of these is that each of these is paralleled from primary qualitative research. So thematic synthesis, any of you who are already familiar with thematic analysis of primary research will see similarities there. Framework synthesis has its parallel in framework analysis. And as I've mentioned, we've devised a subtype of this called best fit framework synthesis. And then meta-ethnography, the longest and most established method, has been observed to have similarities with grounded theory approaches. So at the same time, it's new ground, but it's familiar ground. And if you're interested in these choices in a bit more detail after I've given a brief overview today, there's an excellent new article. In fact, it's not been published yet. It's dated January 2021 in a repository, but it's not appeared published yet, by Kate Fleming and Jane Noyes, which looks at the different methodologies and methods. So it's a bang up-to-date version that you can get from their repository before it appears in the International Journal of Qualitative Methods. But the advice in that very brief introductory article is consistent with work that I did on a project that Mark was involved in for WHO, where we were looking at different methods for reviewing for complex interventions, and we produced the qualitative versions of that. And there's also a video by my colleague Jane Noyes that goes into some of these methods and examples in a bit more detail. So plenty of ways that you can follow up your initial interest. So first of all, if we look at the role of theory between these 3 competing methods, the 3 leading methods, we can see that thematic synthesis, yes, it can be involved in producing theory, but equally it can produce very descriptive findings that can perhaps inform production of guidelines or recommendations for practice. So very versatile. So we can deal with it at a more superficial level, if I can call it that, or we can go further. And in many cases, that's choices to do with the available data. Framework synthesis essentially builds on an existing theory and then seeks to test that theory and then to expand that theory so that you end up with a version 2.0, if you like, from the testing of the version 1.0. Whereas meta-ethnography actually starts off with the objective of generating theory. And so it's often used to act as a backdrop to research rather than driving forward specific recommendations or courses of action. So taking these in turn, thematic synthesis developed by Thomas and Hardin as part of the Epicenter initiative in London. As mentioned, very much inspired by thematic analysis, cited now over 1,000 times in Web of Science. It seeks to formalize the identification and development of themes, and it looks at themes as being, first of all, descriptive, but then building a layer upon them so that they're analytical. And then it's a method that, as we'll come back to later, can be used as a launch pad for more detailed analysis. So many people have remarked on the similarity between the early stages of meta-ethnography and thematic synthesis. Thematic synthesis is in 3 stages. The first stage is to actually code the findings. Again, very similar to its primary data equivalent. So you can use NVivo. Then you develop your descriptive themes, and then you start to look at the relationship between those descriptive themes. Do some themes come as synergistic with other themes? Do some come as precursors or descendants of other themes? So you're looking at the relationship between them. Or indeed, is there an overarching theme that helps link several of these themes together? So all the fodder, if you like, of primary qualitative data analysis. And their very familiar example, which put down a marker, so it's of historic interest, was on children's perspectives on healthy eating, and they were particularly interested in how that could be used to inform intervention development. So a very pragmatic, practical application, which is a strong indicator of the choice of thematic synthesis. So here's an example of the sort of coding that goes on, line by line coding. When myself and my colleague does a thematic synthesis, we tend to do it in what we call a textual extract, so it's perhaps a sentence or a couple of sentences level. So we don't tend to code at this very line by line method. So thematic synthesis can be themes attached to textual fragments or line by line. Those are sort of 2 different choices, if you like. It's a trade-off of tying yourself very tightly to the data versus trying to get something of the context of the quotation. And then in typical fashion, you then map the data to and the codes into a hierarchical tree structure, and this results in descriptive themes. We did this for a review of work-based learning. So doctors and nurses learning from e-learning programs. And one of the things that struck me was that we had a list of factors, but we didn't really have much about how those factors related to each other. So this very much indicated what Hardin and Thomas suggested, and what we in fact did, which is start to look at the relationship between them. So they said up to this point they'd just produced a synthesis that was very close to the included studies, but they wanted to then, as they describe it, go beyond the findings to generate concepts, understandings, or hypotheses. And this is what they use the terminology of analytical themes. So these analytical themes, you'll see that these immediately act as a sort of both more at a sort of umbrella level. You'll see that they tend to be more generalized. You'll see that they perhaps embody several of the themes brought together in juxtaposition. And there's some very interesting things here. So, for example, the 5 a day that the UK government has promoted doesn't distinguish between the difference between sexy fruit and dull and worthy vegetables. It sort of assumes that children will view both of those the same. So that's a brief gallop through thematic synthesis. Moving on to framework synthesis. Its origins comes very much within the field of policy analysis. Ritchie and Spencer developed the framework analysis as 5 steps. So you familiarize yourself with the corpus that you're going to be analyzing. You identify the appropriate framework. You index the data according to the categories on that framework. You chart the relationships between the framework, and then as your product, you map and interpret what you've done. Really, there are sort of 2 drivers, if you like, for the variants of synthesis that exist. Sandy Oliver, many of you will know, is very much wedded to stakeholder participation, as we all indeed should be. And so very much the framework that she would use with her data would come from stakeholder consultation. Myself and my colleague Chris Carroll, we both have an information science background, so we've focused much more on identifying frameworks from the literature. And one of the reasons we can do that is because of this concept of best fit, of being good enough, so that a framework that is really just a holding position, a sort of flag of convenience, if you like, is good enough to advance our analysis and then can be expanded with any data that doesn't subsequently fit. So framework analysis is best adapted to research with very specific questions, limited time frame, and very much issues that have been identified a priori. So you're very much going into an area that is well traversed, if you like. And it allows you to go beyond the individual case as reported in the qualitative literature to look for what's generalizable by, if you like, grouping patterns and themes under the headings of the framework. And if you think about the fields we work in, there is a lot of health behavior theories that could be frameworks. There are policy frameworks. We've used NHS modernization processes as frameworks. Logic models can be frameworks. So there's no shortage of ways of categorizing data a priori rather than having to generate the themes from the data. And this particular method is very amenable to quick production. So myself and colleagues, primarily colleagues at the Evidence Synthesis Ireland initiative, developed a rapid qualitative Cochrane review, which was done from a protocol to publication in 25 days. And I was privileged to be the methodologist on that group, with all the hard work being done by our Irish colleagues. And we've written up our experience of doing these rapid qualitative evidence syntheses. I don't particularly like the idea of rapid. I prefer resource light, if you like. Not that these are particularly light, but just in the sense of, if you have resource constraints, you might want to use these methods, not just because you have to do something quickly. And there is, in fact, guidance produced by the NHS Improvement Scotland team on doing rapid qualitative evidence synthesis. And so if for any reason you're trying to do a qualitative evidence synthesis with not very much in the way of resources, you might find that some of the methods and inspiration for that could come from this brief document. So, as I mentioned, we were responsible for creating best fit framework synthesis. It's accrued well over 250 citations, nearer 500 now. These figures are out of date. It enables you to move from a conceptual or a policy framework. It allows you to test that framework and then to see if that framework needs expanding by data that doesn't quite fit. And the reason we developed it and its unique characteristic is we developed it to take into account the need for systematic reviews to be auditable and transparent. So in other words, whereas with a traditional framework you can move to and fro creating new concepts, we felt it was important to draw a gap or a line between the concepts in the original framework and the new concepts that we added. And so that separation is the characteristic. It means that you can clearly see what came from the original framework and what we have added. And so this staged model allows us to present that. And of course, what it requires is that you're able to find a theory or framework in the beginning. And so a companion paper that we wrote relates to how do you find these models or frameworks or conceptual models or theoretical frameworks. And so there's a search strategy there that you combine with your interventional condition. And this is what it looks like. So you'll see that in fact it's a hybrid, that the first bit of it is a framework synthesis, and then for any data that doesn't fit, after that sort of double red line that's right in the middle of the slide, you move more into thematic analysis, generating labels for anything that doesn't fit. And it also allows you to use multiple frameworks in a sort of meta framework. So an example from smoking, a work site smoke prevention, for example, fused together an organizational level framework with an individual behavioral framework so that we covered both levels. Here are the stages. Very typical stages, but the key issue is at step 2, where you're doing a parallel search. You've already found the primary research studies, but you now find the framework that you're going to use to analyze them. And here's an example. So this used the SURE World Health Policy framework as a way of looking at barriers and enablers to guideline implementation within obstetrics. And then finally, the third and longest established of the 3 common methods, meta-ethnography. This derived from education. If you can imagine the equivalent of Ofsted educational school reports that we get in this country, Noblit and Hare devised a way of analysing the very dense text of school reports in the United States and came up with a method that they called meta-ethnographies, so that you could learn lessons from the pooled experience of these different schools. And unbeknownst to them, 10 years later, the health community latched on this as a method of choice for doing qualitative synthesis. And it persisted as the leading method for time until Harden and Thomas came along with their alternative. So meta-ethnography is a more interpretive method than the other 2 methods that I've described. It's about making sense of a phenomenon, trying to get a holistic view of it, putting together all the research that's available. It still remains certainly one of the most widely used methods, although thematic synthesis is fast catching up. And this again involves interpretive coding and a thematic process very similar to the thematic synthesis process. Here's a nice little diagram of these 7 steps of meta-ethnography, starting with a form of sensitization and determining the need, then deciding what's relevant, very intensive and iterative reading of the studies, looking for the relationships between the studies, essentially doing the sort of qualitative work that you do on the kitchen table with your post-its. Translating studies, this idea of when 2 authors describe something using the same terms, do they mean the same thing? When they describe them with different terms, do they mean the same thing or do they mean different things? And then synthesizing those translations and then expressing the results. And so here's an example. So looking at why vaginal birth is Poorly taken up after a previous cesarean section. So looking at the experiences of these women in their birth choices, and a very useful sort of way of thinking about things that is often used to discuss the other methods of synthesis are the first order constructs, being those quotes from the participants, so those verbatim quotations. The second order being the authors of the primary studies, and then you're coming in with your interpretation as a team, and you're making interpretations of interpretations, and these are called third order constructs. Many people have said that it's quite difficult to distinguish in primary papers the first order and second order, but the overall thing is that you're trying to integrate these two overarching explanations that line up into a line of argument. And so these third order constructs, again, you can use software to code these. Here we have a nice example because we have three researchers all looking at the same data. They come up with their interpretation of it, and then they get their heads together to decide what their collaborative interpretation is. So very open to interpretation, very open to discussion, very much a team process. And what they did here was they were able to explore issues of context here. They were able to think how study design might have impacted on how women describe their experience. They came up with these third order constructs, and then they came up with the primary version of meta-ethnography, what's called a line of argument, which is an attempt to string together the themes into an explanation for how the women were generally reacting. Now that might all seem very complicated, considering you invited me to help me make sense of the area, but here it is in a slide. So if your topic is well theorized, then it's likely that a framework will exist, and therefore you can start with framework synthesis. If there isn't such a framework, then you default to the simplest and most accessible method, thematic synthesis. However, if in doing the thematic synthesis, you find that your data is like Marilyn Monroe-like millionaires, rich and thick, then that suggests that you may well be able to sustain theory generation. So you can either do thematic synthesis with theory generation, or you can progress to the formal stages of a meta-ethnography. So there it is in a nutshell, simples really. And I'm just going to sort of conclude by just talking about the similarities and differences between systematic review methods and primary qualitative research methods. And this was very much the thesis of my own PhD by publication that I did a few years ago. I was interested in these two research traditions and how they sort of clashed together like tectonic plates at an earthquake. And so I came up with the term that's used elsewhere in the literature, but not in this context, dual heritage, having parents from different cultural backgrounds. And so I was arguing that the parents of the qualitative evidence synthesis were the qualitative research tradition and the systematic review tradition. And as long as we borrow from both appropriately, and we don't misappropriate, then this can be a rich heritage, better than the individual sum of the methodological parts. And we can see examples where qualitative synthesis mimics systematic reviews of quantitative research. So here's what you would expect. It's a new tool to be able to assess the quality of a qualitative systematic review, or QES. And this comes from the SBU team at the technology agency in Sweden. But on the other hand, we've never been shy of borrowing from primary qualitative research, and you'll remember that I've already said that Thomas and Harden did this. And some of the things that we can borrow are the ideas of negative cases, the idea of maximum variation sampling rather than the more of the same that you get with a meta-analysis. But it does open it up to abuse. And one of the criticisms is that if we try and follow the methods of the Cochrane collaboration too much with qualitative synthesis, then we end up creating this Frankenstein's monster. I have to say that this paper by Thorne is very much the sort of phenomenon of the person who discovers a band, and then when everyone else starts liking the band, spends all their time slagging off that band as no longer being relevant. But that might be my particular jaundiced view. But there is no doubt substance to what Thorne has highlighted, that you can be in danger of stripping out the important and fascinating stuff from qualitative research, particularly the context and the conceptual development. So we have to be careful that we're not just sort of gutting a fine piece of qualitative research just to produce something that we can put through a sausage machine of review. But when it's done properly, we can get the creativity there, all the virtues of qualitative approaches. This is from my thesis. It's an attempt to show some of the similarities and differences between the approaches. So the default for systematic reviews is thought to be the comprehensive sample. But looking at the primary qualitative heritage, it opens up the 16 methods of purposive sampling or 16 methods of sampling, I should say, qualitatively, that Patton identified in his primary qualitative textbook. We can see that quality assessment, instead of being a hurdle that you have to get over to get into a review, could actually be just used to moderate or muffle the message that you're getting from the research. We can see that instead of being interested in the average, like meta-analysis, that we're interested in the outliers, the dissonance, the people who are the exceptions, people who have good reasons for not conforming, not behaving, not fitting comfortably with the intervention. And also we see a focus beyond the epidemiological PICO, the population intervention comparison outcome, to an interest in such things as context and concept. And I'd refer you very much to Mark Pettigrew's paper that came out of the BMJ Global Health series to look at the importance of those. So as I said, this is where these tectonic plates collide. Just because people have chosen to apply a formulaic approach and done qualitative synthesis badly in some instances, just really descriptively rehearsing themes and producing something that has the literary merit of a telephone directory, that doesn't necessarily mean that we should reject this as a very useful method when done well. And this is a quotation I used at the end of my my own thesis to rehearse the argument of Theo Lorenc that actually, although we can look at the traditions of qualitative synthesis as coming from both primary qualitative research and quantitative systematic reviews, we also gain by thinking of them as being a particular species of their own with their own requirements. But I suspect that many of the solutions we're looking for to handle problems with complex interventions come from the primary mixed methods rather than going to be generated from, for example, the systematic review quantitative model. So here are some of the ways in which QES methods can help to expand our systematic review toolbox. We can move beyond the comprehensive exhaustive search to use of intelligent sampling from variations, sampling from different parts of our sampling frame. We can see a place for iterative searches where the next search strategy is determined by results from the previous rather than doing a big bang search. We can see the role of complementary search methods rather than everything on the database search. We can see an appropriate role of quality assessment to help to arbitrate rather than to throw out. We can see the value of sensitivity analysis where we look at the contribution of individual studies of different qualities to the themes. We can look at the place of theory, we can look at the place of context, we can look at better use of conceptual frameworks, and we can look at the contribution of the dissenting voice or the dissonance or the example where an intervention doesn't work. And This leads to the current preoccupation, which is can we learn from primary qualitative research with regard to reflexivity? So primary qualitative authors are always reflexive about the influence that they have over their data and in their interpretation. And it's really to be welcomed that Sue Down on the left-hand side here and the Epoch group within Cochrane are now encouraging that we produce these reflexive statements to say exactly what our own influence is likely to have been on the data that we've interpreted. And we've been using these in our own WHO guidelines work. So I'm going to conclude here. Just a couple of minutes over time, so hopefully you'll forgive me. That we can conclude that qualitative evidence synthesis still remains perhaps a bit like a dog walking on its hind legs. It's not always done well, but you're still surprised to find it done at all. And it's really encouraging to see that the volte-face by people like Ian Chalmers to recognise the valuable contribution that qualitative synthesis can be made alongside, but as an equal partner of the effectiveness research. So thank you for your attention. I have sent around the slides beforehand, so you've got reference to these, and here are just some of the references that I've mentioned in passing. So thank you. I'm open to questions. Thanks for